Hello there, this is Dimitris Christou again, and we're ready for another video tutorial. Better be honest, this isn't, your standard video tutorial. It is just one thing I'd like you guys to spend some time with and get familiar with. And when we're done, when you try playing with it and create some of your own experiments with these materials, you'll be gaining twice, and one, because you'll understand how layering the texture works, and you might also end up with some cool textures for you to use for your Blender scenes. Now I'll hit a delete to erase the default cube, and I'll hit Shift A to add a plane. We got the plane in place, and I'll right click the camera to select it and hit Alt G to clear the position, and Alt R to clear the rotation for the camera, and I'll hit 0 now on my memory keypad and hit G and Z to grab my camera on the Z axis and move it back at about there. And what I'm also going to do is change the render resolution. I'm going to set it for both X and Y at 1024. Okay, and if I'm not mistaken, the right location for the Z-axis for the camera is, for a plane of this size, is at about 2.2. Okay, now I'll add the material to my plane, and I'll just render an image, and as you can see, we have the plane framed nicely. I'll hit the escape key and also set the render output to be at 100%. And now that we have the material, we can move right here at the texture panel, and we will add textures and eventually try to see how they mix together, and also try to have a nice little texture at the end, a texture that we can use for our scenes and animation. Now what I generally do is, and I'm moving back to the material, is change a mid luminance color for this one. I don't want it to be either too light or too dark, and I'll also bring the specular intensity down to 0.1, so that we're having just a bit of specularity here, and you'll see how it'll work later on. And time to add the textures. I'll click new and change the name from texture to texture 1, and I won't be naming the textures with a specific name, just because we'll be creating a kind of setup where you can easily come and change the texture and the texture settings and change them all to get a whole new material for your objects. Now what I generally do is that the first texture is generally slightly big, and I'm going to change the size. Let's make it slightly large, and this is going to be sort of the base for the other textures to be put on. I'll increase the depth, and now I'll click both so we can see both the texture and the material. and it's time for me to change the color. We won't be using this one, and let's make it a dark brown. Okay, I'll hit F12 now to render an image, and you can see what we get. We're having a texture that is and you know, it doesn't use all that detail, but it still sets some sort of mood and some sort of waves and lines here for the textures that are about to follow. Now escape key, and I'll add another texture. I'm going to call this one texture 2, and this time around we'll also be using a clouds texture, and for this one I'm going to change the basis. Let's change it to, I don't know, Voronoi F2. Okay, and I think this is too bright. You can always come right here to the colors, and I'll decrease the brightness, and you can see right here. Okay, let's make it also slightly bigger than the default. I'm going to set it at about, let's say, 0.6. and I'll also increase the depth. I'll bring it up to 4, and let's also change the color. I'll make it also a slightly brighter brown color at about here. And for this one, for this texture, I think that since we got all this little detail here, it'll be nice to add some normal, and I'll set the normal. I think at 1 it's way too strong. I'll set it to 0.3, and I'll hit F12 now to render another image, and you can already see how it looks. I'll hit the escape key, and you can see that we have the specular highlights kicking in, and that's because, let me find the light. Okay, here's the default lamp. I'll hit 7 again and 5 to switch to top auto view, and you can see that the default lamp is right here, so we have the specular highlights coming from the right. I'll render again, and you know, if we were to make the colors gray for this one, it could also be a nice basic stone texture. Okay, let's move on. Now I'm right clicking the plane to select it again, and this time around I'll create a new texture. Well, you're guessing right, texture 3. And for this one we'll leave the type to clouds again, and I'll change the basis. Let's change it to Voronoi F3, and for this one I'm going to increase the contrast just a bit and turn the brightness down. And what I'm also going to do is decrease the size. So we want this texture here to add some tiny bit of detail to our material. I'll decrease the size, set it to 0.05, and let's make this again a bright brown. almost orange. And I'll also add some, since we have all this little detail, I'll add some normal to it, but this time it'll be pretty low at 0.05. We just want it to show up as a bump map, and you can see what we get. And I think this one looks pretty much like some sort of leather or something. I like it. I'll hit the escape key and I'm going to save this one. I'm going to save it as texture tutorial. Okay. And as always, we're just having fun with it. We're experimenting and trying uh, overlapping textures and moving on. What I'll also want to try with this one is to change, since we haven't tried to change it for any of our textures. I'll try to change the size for the material, and we'll set it, we'll give it an X value of 10 from 1. I'll hit F12 again, and as you can see, by changing the X value, we're making our texture to be squashed 10 times in the X-axis. So now we have those interesting lines. You see, this one is squashed and gives us that result, these lines right here, and I really hope you can clearly see this one. So it now looks, yeah, pretty much like some sort of wood, and I think it's also nice. You can see that we have the specular highlights creating, you know, some sort of light right here. We have the normal applied first for this one. For this texture right here, you can see the big bump chunks here, and you can also see the smaller normal for these little vertical lines. And I think it looks pretty nice, and we could stop right here, but let's add another texture. Let's call this texture 4. And let's also keep this one at the clouds setting and increase the depth, set it up to 4, and I'm going to change the color for it. Let's make it slightly red, and I'll decrease the color influence for this one. I'll set it to 0.4, and what I pretty much want about this one is to set the final tone or the final color for the material, for the textures. And since we want this one to set the color, we can change the blend from mix, let's say to, let's set it to color, and let's take another look. I'll hit F12 again, and it doesn't do all that much. Now, whenever you have doubts about whether your texture affects the material, you can always try to change the color to something, to something crazy, and then hit F12 to render an image, just so you can see how it affects the textures below it. And I'll be honest with you and tell you that I really like how this looks. Just going to bring it at about here and let's render again. Okay, it looks nice. So hitting the escape key again, and that's pretty much it. You can see that we have a single plane, and just by stacking textures over textures we've created a very interesting result. And I'm going to show you one final thing. Now what I'm going to do is hit Shift A to add another plane, and I'll hit 1 on my numeric keypad and 5 to switch to front ortho, and I'll hit zoom in and hit G to grab it and Z to constrain movement on the Z axis, and I'll move it up just a bit at 0.0010. Now I'll hit the tab key to switch from object to edit mode, and I'll hit the S key to scale it on the Y axis at 0.1, or perhaps let's make it even smaller at about there. And now tab key to go back to object mode, and I'll hit 7 on my numeric keypad, and I'll hit the G key to grab and the Y key to move it on the Y axis, and I'll move this one down. And what I'm going to do now is move right here at the modifier panel and add an array modifier. I'll deselect the relative offset. I'm going to zero this one out. I'm going to click constant offset and set the Y value to 1 or to 0.5, and I'll just increase the count to 5. Now I really want to make it even thinner, so I'm hitting the tab key to switch from object to edit mode, and I'll hit the S key to scale and the Y, scale it on the Y axis, and let's move it at about here. Now tab key again, and I'm going to add a black material for this one, for those horizontal lines. I'm going to bring the specular down also, and we can also click shadeless. And what I'm going to do now is hit Shift D to duplicate the entire setup, and hit the R key to rotate for 90 degrees. And as you can see, we now have the vertical lines. Now 0 to switch to camera perspective view, and if we now hit F12 or click here to render an image, you can see that we're getting some sort of tiles. Now I don't really think it looks all that great with this material, but you can always use those arrays to create some tiles. You could also bring the Y offset to 0.25 and increase the count amount to 9, and do the same thing for the vertical lines. And the good thing about it, and since we're using procedural textures for our materials, you can always render a huge image and therefore get a pretty detailed texture for your scenes. I'll increase the output value for the render to 200%, so now we're getting a 2048 for X and 2048 for Y, and I'll render a final image. And again, these are procedurals. You can zoom in as much as you like, and you can render your images to be pretty high resolution, and they'll always look perfect. And if you spend some time with it, you'll find out that you can create a bunch of textures, a bunch of materials that you would otherwise have to search for and download and even pay for some of them. So this is it. I'd like you guys to spend some time with working with textures, and you'll find out that you'll use it pretty often for your scenes. You can also create your materials for your scenes using only procedurals. I've done it lots of times, and you don't have to use textures, and you don't even have to pack the textures and search for them and whatever. So I think this is pretty nice to know. Feel free to experiment. I'll be posting some images, and as always, upload a blend file for you to check and learn a stuff or two. So this is it. Thanks for watching.